Beneath the rain-washed skies of Bath, a once glittering Duchess sits behind glass, a prisoner of whispers and a past that refuses to loosen its grip. Her world is measured in corridors and shadows, until a stray dog breaks the garden wall, and a stranger follows, one gaze, one trespass, a crack in the silence. But can hope survive the weight of duty, the bite of scandal, and a secret that trembles at the edge of revelation? Tonight, a single choice will shape a destiny: vanish with grace or live out loud. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And one question: what do you adore most about period romances? The slow burn longing, the grand settings, or defying society's rules? Bath, England. The year is 1815. The air smells of coal smoke, damp stone, and faded glory. In the grand drawing rooms of society, the war may be over, but not all battles are fought with swords. Some are waged in silence, in the hidden chambers of the heart. Whitcomb House, perched on the northern rise of the city, appeared to the world like a poem left unfinished. A once celebrated estate, now draped in quiet melancholy. Ivy curled along the stone balustrades, unchecked, like time itself creeping over memories best left unspoken. The windows were tall, many shuttered save one, the window that belonged to Lady Eleanor Ashworth. The Duchess sat there, as she had each morning since the first bloom of snowdrops 3 years before. Her figure, always upright, always composed, was framed by ivory drapes like a portrait come to life. She was but 24, though sorrow had carved a stillness into her posture, a precision into her silence that defied her years. Her gown was of dove-grey muslin, the bodice modestly adorned with a narrow band of embroidery. A shawl, the colour of crushed lavender, lay across her knees, though the room was warm. Beneath it, her legs remained perfectly still. The accident had left its mark not only upon her body, but upon the very air of Whitcomb. What once echoed with laughter and strings now yielded only to the measured tick of the mantel clock, the rustle of paper, the discreet cough of a servant. Life had reduced itself to routine: breakfast taken in solitude, correspondence answered with a gloved hand, a daily turn about the south garden, weather permitting, and evening spent by the fire in a silence thick as velvet. Lady Eleanor was not unloved. Lady Beatrice Liddon, her aunt, remained ever present, hovering with firm affection and sharp observations. "The world," she often declared, "will forget a widow, but never a duchess. You must choose which you wish to be." Yet Eleanor, for all her intellect and wit, could not yet bear the weight of society's eyes, not when they glanced so quickly from her face to the wheels beneath her, not when their sympathy felt like salt rather than balm. It was on one such morning, when the April wind tugged at the budding branches and the sky hung low with the promise of rain, that the silence cracked. A bark, loud, insistent, irreverent. Lady Eleanor lifted her gaze from the book resting in her lap. It had not been the bark of a garden spaniel or a neighbour's collie. It had been nearer, wilder. Then came the scuffle, paws against gravel, a yelp, the sound of something crashing through hedges. Mrs. Baines, the housekeeper, rushed into the room, cheeks flushed and cap askew. "My lady, there's a dog in the rose garden, a large one, and a man with it." Eleanor blinked. "A man?" "Yes, my lady, a stranger. And he's trespassed directly through the south gate. Shall I fetch the groundskeeper?" But Eleanor had already wheeled herself forward, her fingers firm upon the rim of the brass-rimmed wheels. Her heart, so long lulled into still rhythm, beat now with an unfamiliar urgency. A stranger? In the garden. She moved through the corridor like a whisper, the old wood of the floors creaking beneath her wheels, as if in protest of this sudden deviation from routine. The doors to the terrace opened with effort, and there, beyond the espaliered pear trees and between the fallen arch of the rose trellis, stood a man. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his coat damp from the mist. One hand gripped the collar of a large, mud-streaked dog, whose tail beat the ground in jovial ignorance. The man's other hand brushed back strands of dark, wind-tossed hair from a forehead lined by care more than age. He turned. Their eyes met. He did not look away. He did not flinch. He did not stare at the chair. Instead, he offered a polite, if sheepish, bow. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. My dog appears to have mistaken your garden for an open field. He has poor taste in boundaries." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, not in offense, but in surprise. His voice was low, with the tempered roughness of one accustomed to issuing orders in open air. His accent was refined, but not polished to aristocratic gloss. She lifted her chin. "It is not the dog who has trespassed, sir. Dogs are creatures of instinct. Men have choices." The corner of his mouth curved, neither a smile nor a smirk, but something between acknowledgement and challenge. "Then allow me to make the right one, Duchess. I shall remove myself and my creature at once." And yet he made no move. Eleanor studied him in the soft grey light. His clothes were plain but well made, a dark wool coat, buff-colored trousers tucked into riding boots, muddied by the garden path. His hands, though gloveless, bore faint scars, not the careless scars of boys or fops, the kind left by blade or consequence. She inhaled. "What is your name?" "Gabriel Harrow," he answered. "Captain, formerly of the 11th Light Dragoons." Mrs. Baines, who had arrived behind Eleanor in breathless haste, gasped. "A soldier." But Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "What brings a cavalry officer to the gardens of Whitcomb?" Gabriel gestured vaguely toward the boundary hedges. "A rented cottage just beyond that rise. My dog escaped through a gate I failed to latch." I followed. There was a pause. Not of tension, but of something else. Appraisal, curiosity, a fragile thread suspended between two lives, stitched shut too long. "You may walk your dog on the south path," Eleanor said at last, her voice even, though her heart betrayed her. "If you keep him from the flower beds." Gabriel nodded, the faintest crease of surprise touching his brow. "A generous allowance." "My thanks." He turned to go. The dog gave a final wag, then followed. But as Eleanor watched him disappear beyond the hedge, she realized her hands were trembling faintly upon the wheels, not from fear, nor from exertion, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. The dawn that followed the rain carried with it a mist so delicate it hovered like a veil across the fields of Somerset. From the east, the pale sun pressed shyly against the orchard's trees, painting their wet bark with a silver sheen. Dew clung to every petal and leaf, refracting the morning light into a soft prism that wrapped the earth in quiet reverence. It was the kind of morning that did not rush, but rather waited, listened for hearts to open. Captain Gabriel Harrow stood beside an old apple tree, his gloved hands resting loosely on the handle of a spade. He had risen before the light, as he always did since the war, when dreams came hot and quick, dragging him from sleep with a racing heart and the echo of cannon fire that no longer existed. But today, the rhythm of the orchard offered him something different, something still. He dug without haste, turning the soil near a wild patch of herbs that had grown rebellious under the neglect of seasons. His dog, a thick-chested mastiff named Flint, sprawled beneath a quince tree, tongue lolling, eyes half-closed with contentment. The wind rustled the trees gently, and in the distance, the silhouette of Whitcomb House stood regal and unmoved upon its hill. He paused. That window, the tall one on the upper floor. Yes, that was where he had seen her. The Duchess. Yesterday, her voice had been calm, almost measured, but her eyes had pierced through the wet morning like a blade of light. She had not looked away, and when she had spoken, it had not been in the sing-song tone of noble women shielding discomfort with pleasantries. It had been sharp, honest. Gabriel brushed the dirt from his gloves and turned back toward the low fence that separated his modest cottage plot from the wilder woods that surrounded Whitcomb's grounds. He did not expect to see her again, and yet he did. It was nearer to noon when he crossed the trellis that marked the estate's edge. The path was still damp from the night's rain, but it had been cleared recently, and he followed its winding course with careful steps. In one hand, he carried a small basket, apples, still blushed with spring's chill, collected from his own orchard. A peace offering, or perhaps a gesture with no name at all. He did not expect her to be there, but she was. Lady Eleanor Ashworth sat beneath the shade of a yew tree, her chair angled toward a cluster of white camellias in full bloom. Her gown today was a soft blue, trimmed in white at the collar and sleeves, and her golden brown hair had been gathered into a modest chignon, with 2 tendrils artfully escaping to frame her cheeks. She looked like something carved from morning light and resilience. She turned her head slightly at the sound of footsteps. Her expression did not shift to alarm nor welcome. It simply observed. "You've returned," she said, not a question, but a statement laced with suspicion and amusement in equal measure. "I have," Gabriel replied, lifting the basket, "bearing tribute lest your camellias revolt." She glanced at the apples, then at him. "Is that how soldiers speak to duchesses, with fruit and irony?" "Only when the Duchess allows it." A soft, almost imperceptible twitch touched the corners of her mouth. "You presume I am so permissive?" "I suppose," he said, stepping forward slowly. "I presume you wouldn't be here if you weren't." Eleanor lowered her gaze, but only for a moment. Her hands were gloved, folded neatly in her lap, fingers twined in stillness. "My housekeeper will tell you I never sit in this garden." "Then she'll have much to discuss over tea." She arched an eyebrow. "And what will you tell your dog should he demand a report?" Gabriel exhaled through his nose, the smallest ghost of a laugh. "That I met a duchess who asked questions as though they were weapons." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Rather, it was filled with the ache of possibility. Birds chirped distantly. A breeze lifted the hem of her shawl and set it dancing against the wheel of her chair. Gabriel noted it with care but made no move to adjust it. He had learned long ago that to reach for something not offered was to break trust before it formed. "I suppose you've noticed," she said quietly, "that I'm not like other women." He looked at her, not at the chair, not at her stillness, but at the exact meeting of her eyes. "I've noticed you're not like other duchesses." She tilted her head, intrigued. "And what are other duchesses like, Captain Harrow?" "Eager to remind you of what you'll never be." The words came before he could temper them. Too raw, too true. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, then closed. She looked down at her hands. "My father was not titled," Gabriel continued, voice gentler now. "He was a surgeon. I rose through merit, not lineage. I have been in many drawing rooms where silence greeted my presence more loudly than words ever could. And yet, you trespass gardens," she said, still not meeting his gaze, "and bring apples. Perhaps I believe fruit and irony are a more effective introduction." At last, she looked up again, and this time, she did not look away. "You are not what I expected, nor are you." A breeze passed again between them. Her hand lifted slowly and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. The motion was small, unthinking, but Gabriel's eyes followed it, as though it held more weight than any courtly gesture. "I'm told," she said after a moment, "that the orchard on this estate once bloomed so thickly in spring that the air turned white with petals. My husband wanted it removed. He thought it too unruly." Gabriel glanced around. The orchard bore signs of abandonment, trees overgrown, roots buckling the path, but still it breathed, still it offered. "I think it suits you," he said. She blinked, startled. Unruly? Alive? A silence bloomed again, lush, unspeakable. The kind that sits heavy between two people who do not yet know what they've begun. Gabriel stepped back, suddenly aware that he had lingered too long. "I should let you rest," he said. "These apples bruise easily." She nodded, but just before he turned, she spoke again, so softly he almost missed it. "Leave them on the bench, Captain." He did. Then, without bow or flourish, he left. That evening in the quiet cottage tucked behind the trees, Gabriel sat at his desk. His journal lay open, and by the flicker of a single candle he wrote, "She did not speak like a duchess. She spoke like a woman who had once trusted the world and now waited for it to prove her wrong. She did not look through me, she looked at me. I did not feel lesser, I felt seen." He paused. The candle sputtered. Flint groaned softly in his sleep. "I have met women in Paris salons and Spanish villas, none who said so much with so little. None who made silence feel like a conversation waiting to happen." He closed the book with care. Outside, the orchard whispered with wind, and beyond it, Whitcomb House stood, tall and silent against the stars. But one window remained lit. The rose gardens of Whitcomb House had once been legendary, an orchestration of fragrance and bloom that had drawn visitors from as far as London during the height of the summer season. But now they slumbered in disarray. The paths were half swallowed by moss and creeping ivy. The beds overflowed with tangled weeds, and thorned branches climbed over fallen trellises like desperate fingers grasping towards something forgotten. Lady Eleanor Ashworth gazed upon this quiet ruin from her chair beneath the eastern arch, where the remains of a carved stone bench stood blanketed in lichen. The morning mist still clung to the ground, rising in curls, like the breath of the earth itself. The air was damp, and the sky carried a threat of drizzle, but the silence, oh, the silence, held a different quality now. It was no longer merely stillness, it was anticipation. She had not come to this corner of the estate in over 2 years, and yet she was here, not because someone had insisted, not because of duty, but because a certain man, unexpected, unreadable, had appeared at the edge of her world with neither pity nor presumption in his gaze. A man who offered nothing but apples and conversation, and something even rarer, the sense that she might still matter outside the walls of her own pain. "Your Grace," came the voice from the lower path. Captain Gabriel Harrow appeared through the break in the hedge, his coat speckled with soil, sleeves rolled, hair damp from exertion or morning dew. He carried a simple wooden tool basket in one hand and a folded paper in the other. Flint trotted at his side, tail wagging once, before settling obediently by the stone steps. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting," he said, his voice as even as the sky, but warmer than it had any right to be. Eleanor arched a brow. "It is not yet noon, Captain. I suspect for a soldier that qualifies as sleeping in." He gave a slow smile, not wide, but true. "We used to call this the hour of ration bread and bruised apples. I thought we might improve upon that today." He held out the paper. She accepted it with gloved fingers. Unfolded, it revealed a sketch, neat lines drawn with precise hand. A garden ramp, simple in structure but considerate in design, winding along the outer hedge and curving with the landscape. There were notes in the margins, dimensions, questions scribbled in faint pencil. "You've been planning," she said, her voice quieter now. Gabriel met her gaze. "If I'm to assist in the reclamation of these roses, I intend for your supervision to be thorough." Eleanor looked back at the drawing. The idea was absurd, and yet practical, achievable. She had long since tired of impractical kindness. This, however, was something else entirely, something that allowed her to imagine standing, not on her feet, but in command of her surroundings again. Dr. Kent, who had visited that very morning, had said as much. "If you wait until you feel ready," he had told her, "you'll remain still forever. Let readiness catch up with you, Eleanor." Now, as Gabriel knelt by the overgrown bed and began cutting away dead stems, she watched with a curiosity she dared not voice. He worked without theatrics, sleeves damp at the elbows, earth clinging to his boots. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet diligence that did not need attention to justify itself. "You've done this before," she observed. He did not look up. "My mother was a gardener. Before she took ill, she used to keep an herb plot behind our house. It was the one place no one dared disturb. And your father was a surgeon, thought flowers were a distraction." Gabriel chuckled, soft and fleeting. until he began using their oils to soothe his nerves. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the spade in his hand. "You don't seem easily rattled." "I'm not," he said, pausing, "except when someone tells me roses are beyond saving." A strange sensation unfurled in her chest, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but something caught in the space between. She turned her eyes away, and they landed on Mrs. Baines, who stood some distance back, watching with tight lips and folded arms. The housekeeper approached slowly, curtsying stiffly. "Your Grace, the cook asks if you'll be returning for luncheon." Eleanor did not answer at once. Her fingers traced the edge of the sketch, still resting in her lap. Then quietly she said, "Send a tray to the terrace. I'll remain here." Mrs. Baines did not respond, but her glance toward Gabriel was sharp. She departed without comment, her skirts swishing like reprimand. Gabriel noticed. "She's protective of you." "She's protective of order," Eleanor replied. "I disrupted the schedule." He nodded, resumed digging. "Schedules are for battlefields. Gardens require chaos." That drew a real laugh, short, surprised, from her lips. It startled her, and she saw with quiet satisfaction it startled him too. For the better part of the next hour, she watched him work. The scent of disturbed earth mingled with the faint perfume of surviving blooms, and the occasional cry of a faraway bird punctuated the silence. It was not the elegance of society, nor the tension of formality. It was something simpler, honest. Later, the sky began to darken, and Eleanor reluctantly gestured toward the house. "You should go. The rain will begin again soon." Gabriel rose, wiped his hands on a cloth. "I'll return tomorrow, if that's acceptable." She hesitated. Her fingers gripped the arm of her chair. The old instinct rose. Say no, withdraw, protect yourself from what might follow. But then, as the wind shifted, she smelled the cut roses, the soil, the breath of spring rising from the ground like promise. "Yes," she said at last, "but bring gloves. You're too proud to admit those thorns left marks." He smiled again, more fully this time, and with a small bow, he left. The following days passed in rhythms Eleanor had forgotten. Gabriel returned each morning, sometimes with tools, sometimes with a question, once with a single rose he had uncovered from beneath a bramble. Each visit was unhurried, unforced. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. But always, always, she felt the edges of herself softening, expanding. But as Whitcomb's gardens awakened, so too did the eyes of Bath. It began with glances, curious ones from the kitchen staff, narrowed ones from Mrs. Baines. Then came the questions from neighbors passed in carriages, and finally, inevitably, Lady Honoria Vale appeared in her pale blue chaise, eyes shaded by a parasol but glinting with unspoken menace. "My dear Eleanor," she cooed from the terrace one afternoon, "how charming to see you outside, and with such vigorous company." Eleanor stiffened. "Captain Harrow is aiding with the gardens. Nothing more." "Of course," Lady Honoria purred, her fan snapping open with a flick. "It's just that one hears things. A Duchess so isolated, so tragic, so very open to companionship." The implication coiled between them like smoke. Eleanor smiled tightly. Perhaps one hears too much? But the damage had begun. Within days, the whispers reached town that the Duchess, poor paralyzed Eleanor, was inviting a soldier into her private gardens, that her sense had withered with her strength, that perhaps the rumors of madness had not been so unfounded after all. Gabriel noticed it. She saw it in the way he looked at her, measured now, careful. "I can stop," he said quietly one afternoon as they stood beside a bed of reborn violets. "You shouldn't," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The house felt smaller again, the windows darker, until one evening, as the rain returned with soft fury, a knock echoed through the hall. A footman delivered a package. Inside, a roll of parchment, a new design, a ramp, curved, beautiful, carved with care, with her initials marked into the side. No note, no need for one. Eleanor sat at her writing desk long into the night. The sketch spread before her like a map to a land she no longer feared, and just before she blew out the candle, she whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for not believing I was fragile." Evening fell upon Bath with its usual elegance, the lamps flickering to life one by one, like pearls strung along the neck of the city. The cobblestone streets gleamed under a soft drizzle, and the scent of damp lilacs curled through the air. Carriages clattered past storefronts and garden gates, bound for parlours filled with music, laughter, and the curated delight of aristocratic pretense. Inside Whitcomb House, the glow of candlelight touched everything with hesitant warmth, though the corridors still carried the hush of solemnity. In Eleanor's chamber, Lady Beatrice Liddon stood before the fireplace, arms crossed over her ample bosom, the embroidered folds of her emerald pelisse rustling as she turned to face her niece. "You are not a ghost," Beatrice said firmly, "nor a portrait collecting dust. It is time they saw that you are still a woman and still a duchess." Eleanor sat near the window, her shawl folded over her lap, her hands as still as porcelain. The brush of the firelight across her cheek revealed not fear, but the familiar ache of hesitation. "Society," she replied, her voice quiet but unwavering, "does not welcome what it cannot define. I have been redefined, Aunt, without my consent." Beatrice's gaze softened, but her tone remained resolute. "Then take it back. Take their expectations and crush them under the wheels of that chair if you must. But do not allow them to imagine you vanished. Appear at Lady Honoria Vale's musicale. Let them see you on your own terms." Eleanor looked away, toward the darkened gardens below. It had rained earlier, and the roses bent with the weight of water and bloom. She thought of the ramp, now fully installed, designed by the hand of a man who never once called her weak. "I'll go," she said at last, the words steady as marble, "but I'll not dance." Lady Beatrice smiled behind the brim of her turban. "Let them wonder what you might do. It's far more powerful than showing them what you won't." The gown chosen for the occasion was a deep shade of indigo, its high waistline adorned with understated embroidery and silver thread. The sleeves were long, tapering delicately over her wrists, and the neckline, modest yet sculpted, revealed the quiet elegance of a woman who had not forgotten refinement. Her hair was dressed in soft curls, pinned with a single comb of jet and pearl. It was the first time in years Eleanor had dressed for anything beyond solitude. As she gazed into the looking-glass, she did not see a duchess or a patient. She saw a woman returning to her own reflection. The halls of Lady Vale's residence were lit with grandeur, chandeliers dripping crystal onto velvet carpets, and footmen stationed like ornaments at every archway. The drawing room itself was transformed into a stage of whispered intentions. Candles flickered from candelabra along the walls, illuminating guests in silks and satins, jewels and brocade. Laughter danced lightly across the room, shallow and performative. When Eleanor entered, all movement slowed. Her chair, crafted in polished walnut and brass, glided across the floor as if guided by silence itself. The wheels made no sound, but the ripples she caused were deafening. Heads turned, fans fluttered. Conversations fractured and resumed in brittle tones. It was not mockery that met her, but something more cutting, pity. She felt it prick at her skin like nettles. A few curtsied, a few turned away, some merely stared, but she held her head high. Lady Beatrice stood beside her like a shield of steel and velvet. "Smile, Eleanor," she whispered. "Even if your heart is cracking, they fear dignity more than rage." Lady Honoria descended upon them moments later, all grace and fox-like sweetness. "My dearest Duchess," she purred, bending slightly in a mock bow. "How splendid to see you in town. I dare say you have been missed." Eleanor met her gaze, unblinking. "Have I? I hadn't noticed." A flicker of something, irritation perhaps, flashed in Honoria's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "We have all been so concerned, of course. Grief, such a difficult companion, and isolation, so easy a prison. But how fortunate you are to have Lady Beatrice and such devoted new acquaintances." There was a pause, one long enough to draw attention, short enough to escape rebuttal. "I hear," Honoria continued, "that your garden has made a miraculous recovery. Some say the gardener is rather handsome." Eleanor did not take the bait. "It is the soil, not the hands, that grows the roses." Honoria tilted her head, her smile brittle. "Indeed." As she swept away, the string quartet began a soft minuet. Eleanor's breathing was shallow, the weight of too many eyes pressed upon her shoulders, invisible but unbearable. Her fingers curled tightly around the carved arms of her chair, and then a voice. "Your Grace." It was low, familiar, and warm. Eleanor turned and found him there, Gabriel, not in mud-stained coat or rolled sleeves, but in a dark evening tailcoat that clung to his frame with quiet authority. His cravat was tied with modest care, and his gloves, dark leather, worn but clean, were tucked into the crook of his arm. His hair had been brushed back, yet still held a defiant curl near his temple. He looked both completely out of place and entirely unbothered by it. "You came," she said, startled. "I was invited," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers, "though I suspect it was more to observe than participate." Her lips parted, but no answer came. He bowed his head slightly. "May I ask you something unorthodox?" Her heart stammered. "What would that be?" "A dance." She looked at him, then down at the wheels beneath her. A flush rose to her cheeks, not of embarrassment, but of resistance to the surge of longing that caught her unprepared. "I cannot, I know," he said gently, "but may I join you, seated, here, in this room, in this moment, without expectation or performance, only intention?" The music swelled. Guests looked on, not pretending otherwise. She nodded. And so, in the very heart of the room where she had once feared only shame, Gabriel knelt beside her, one knee to the floor, one hand outstretched, not in pity, not in theater, but in equal offering. She placed her hand in his. Their fingers touched. His palm was warm, hers gloved but trembling, and they moved, not in sweeping steps, but in a slow, graceful turn. He turned her chair gently as they pivoted together in the center of the room, his body rising, her wheels gliding. Their eyes never left one another. Gasps, whispers, silence. The room held its breath. Eleanor's heart beat not with fear, but with a fragile defiance. The music pressed forward. So did they. At the back of the room, Lady Honoria Vale narrowed her eyes, not out of scorn, but calculation. And in that moment, Eleanor understood something she had not before. She was no longer the one being watched. She was the one who had changed what was possible to see. When the music ended, Gabriel bowed his head once more. "Thank you for the honor, Your Grace." Eleanor, breathless and awake, allowed herself the smallest smile. "The honor was mine, Captain." And as she turned her chair toward the windows, the hush remained behind her like a tide, refusing to rise. For the first time in years, she felt taller than everyone else in the room. The rain returned with a bitterness not seen since winter, falling in slanted sheets that blurred the lamplight and turned the cobblestones of Bath to rivers of reflection. In the heart of the city, beneath the gleam of polite chandeliers and painted smiles, a storm far more insidious was gaining momentum, one made not of clouds, but of ink. Whispers that had once fluttered in corners now walked boldly through the front doors of drawing rooms. Lady Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Whitcomb, had become a subject again, but not of admiration, of ridicule. It began with a single leaflet, carelessly dropped near the assembly rooms. Printed without signature, it bore the ornate title, "A Treatise on the Frailty of the Female Mind," a gentleman's concern for the growing eccentricities of certain noble widows, and a soldier's alarming influence on their discretion. At first, it was passed hand to hand with curious amusement, but by the week's end, it multiplied. Dozens, then hundreds. The wording grew sharper. The Duchess in her chair turned puppet of a common cavalryman, her wits undone by tragedy, her name undone by temptation. Mrs. Baines found one of the pamphlets folded neatly atop the silver tray in the vestibule. Beatrice found another tucked into the edge of the parlor mirror. Eleanor, when she unfolded her third, did so with hands that did not shake, but with a breath she had to fight to keep steady. She read every word, then she folded it once, twice, and set it aflame in the grate. The silence in the drawing room that evening was heavier than the cold smoke curling into the chimney. Beatrice sat across from her, a ledger open in her lap, her spectacles perched on the bridge of her nose, as if logic could somehow restrain fury. "They're cowards," she muttered, hiding behind type and lace. "They are society," Eleanor replied, her voice quiet but edged in steel. "And society does not need proof, only suggestion." Dr. Silas Kent arrived that same evening, brushing the water from his hat and frowning in a way that had nothing to do with weather. He carried with him not only his satchel, but a bundle of sealed envelopes, records, bills, estate documents recently returned from London. "The pamphlets are troubling, yes," he began, "but not unexpected. What troubles me more is here." He laid out the letters, page by page. Beatrice leaned forward, scanning swiftly, her expression tightening with every figure. £30 missing from the tenant allotment in Westfields," she said grimly. 12 from the Cooper's repairs, 5 from the Children's Apothecary Fund. "Eleanor." Eleanor did not flinch. "Continue." Beatrice looked up. "This was Percival's doing. His name is on every authorization. You trusted him to maintain the ledgers while you grieved. These signatures, he knew you wouldn't verify them. That you were too broken," Eleanor finished, "too blind to see the theft behind the condolence." Dr. Kent removed his spectacles. "It's not yet enough to take to the magistrate, but it's a beginning." Outside, thunder murmured like a beast turning in sleep. Gabriel arrived after midnight. The house was quiet, but he was expected. Mrs. Baines lit a lamp without protest and gestured silently toward the study. Gabriel entered without knocking. Eleanor sat behind the desk, the fire casting a low glow behind her. In this light, her features seemed carved from stone, her eyes luminous and cold. "They've named you," she said without greeting. "I've seen it." She nodded once. "They say you seek a title." He met her gaze, unmoving. "I seek you." The fire cracked. The air between them shifted, taut with something unsaid. "You told me once," she murmured, "that war teaches a man to fight. But you did not tell me what peace demands." He stepped forward. "Peace demands resilience, not silence. But I am not made of armor, Gabriel. I am made of bruises stitched with memory. I have rebuilt myself from pieces, carefully, stubbornly, and now they strip me again, page by page." She stood then, pushed up from the chair with slow, deliberate grace, using her cane to steady herself. She walked 3 steps. No more, but it was enough. "I cannot, will not become a symbol for anyone, not for pity, not for scandal, and not even for love." He watched her with reverence, not resistance. "You are not a symbol, Eleanor. You are a woman, a flame that refuses to be extinguished. They write lies because they are afraid of what your truth reveals about them." "And what is my truth, Captain? That you lived, that you chose not to fade, that you defy every expectation they cradle like gospel." The silence that followed was full of breathless defiance and something deeper. Eleanor's eyes softened. "They will not let me rest." "Then do not rest," he replied. "Rise." Later that night, Gabriel walked alone through the mist. The city was still, save for the echo of his boots on wet stone and the low rumble of wheels far in the distance. He did not return to the cottage. He turned instead toward the gentleman's club, where Lord Percival Ashworth often lingered past midnight, confident in his nobility and his Scotch. Gabriel found him precisely as expected, lounging in a leather armchair, brandy in hand, surrounded by men who laughed too easily. The moment their eyes met, the laughter died. "Captain," Percival said with a slow grin, "how rare. Come to return the Duchess's fan, or collect your reward." Gabriel crossed the room without pause, stopped inches from him. "You will cease your slander," Percival chuckled. "Oh, my dear cavalryman, this isn't the battlefield. This is society. And here I do not lose. Gabriel's voice dropped to a whisper, low and lethal. You already have. You just haven't yet been informed. He turned and left, not waiting for an answer. Behind him, silence fell again, uneasy and absolute. At Whitcomb House, Eleanor stood by the window, a candle flickering beside her. She had not gone to bed. She could not. The weight of perception pressed against the glass like rain. Beatrice joined her quietly. You know, when you were a girl, she said, you used to run barefoot through those rose paths. You laughed like wind, Eleanor, like something that couldn't be caught. Eleanor did not answer, but her eyes glistened. Beatrice laid a hand on her shoulder. You are still that girl. Even if you no longer run, you have never stopped defying gravity. In the days that followed, new pamphlets appeared, more vicious, more specific. The accusations painted Eleanor not as mad, but dangerous. Gabriel as manipulative, their connection as illicit. Yet through it all, she did not flinch. She wrote letters. She visited tenants in her carriage. She allowed herself to be seen, not as the woman they described, but as the woman she chose to be. And when Dr. Kent returned with more ledgers, more proof of Percival's manipulation, she did not wait for others to act. She picked up the quill and began to write a letter of her own, to the magistrate, to the truth, to the end of silence. In the shadows of that ink, something shifted. A war was beginning, and this time she would not be the casualty. She would be the victor. The sky had only just begun to soften from black to violet when Eleanor's carriage rolled away from the gates of Whitcomb House, its wheels slicing gently through the mist that clung to the countryside like a dream reluctant to end. Wrapped in her velvet pelisse and a shawl of pale grey wool, Eleanor sat across from Gabriel inside the custom-built carriage, its interior tailored to her frame, its space wide enough for grace and dignity. The carriage had been designed not merely for utility but for presence. Brass fixtures gleamed faintly in the candlelight, and the polished walnut panels bore carvings of roses in bloom. Silent testimony to how far she had come since the day she first rolled beneath their petals in silence. Neither of them spoke as the horses trotted into the hills beyond the city. There was no need. The world was still half asleep, the trees heavy with dew, the air cold enough to burn the lungs and awaken the senses. Eleanor pressed her fingertips lightly against the window pane and watched the fields unroll like green silk in the early light. She had forgotten this, the wideness of the world when viewed from something other than a window, the way the horizon curved and beckoned, the way air tasted when it was not filtered through fear or expectation. Gabriel sat with his gloved hands resting on his knees, his jaw clenched, not in tension, but in restraint. He stole glances at her, not indulgent ones, but cautious, reverent, as if memorizing a miracle he had no right to claim. "You're quiet," Eleanor said softly, her voice a whisper in the hush of morning. "So are you," he replied. She turned from the window, meeting his gaze fully. "I'm watching everything I thought I'd lost come back to me." Gabriel looked down, then out. "I wanted you to see this before the city woke, before the world returned with its noise and opinions and rules." He rapped lightly on the carriage wall, and the coachman slowed the horses until they came to a gentle stop at the crest of a hill. Gabriel opened the door and extended his hand, not out of habit, but out of respect. Eleanor took it. She moved carefully, descending the step with practiced grace and standing upright with her cane planted firmly in the earth. The early light caught in her hair, turning the warm strands to amber. A breeze lifted the edges of her shawl, and for a moment she stood completely still. Then she looked up and saw the horizon. It stretched far beyond what she had imagined. The hills unfurled like the skirts of a ballroom. The trees swayed as if preparing for a bow. Beyond the meadows, the faint glimmer of the river caught the dawn like a promise. Her breath caught. "Do you see it?" Gabriel asked, his voice behind her, soft as prayer. "I had forgotten how far the world reached." she murmured. They stood together in silence. Wind passed between them. A lark called from the hedgerow. Below, the land waited for the sun to break fully, but the light already painted the clouds with pale gold. Then Gabriel turned to her, not hurriedly, not hesitantly, but with the steadiness of a man who had run from many things in his life and had decided, finally, to stand. "I'm afraid of you," he said. She looked at him, startled. "What?" "Not of you, Eleanor," he corrected, his voice roughened by honesty, "but of what you are, of what you represent, your name, your lineage, your place in a world that was never built for men like me." Eleanor did not speak, but her gaze held his unwavering. "I know how they see me," he continued, "a soldier who happened to live, a man with calloused hands and no title. They think I seek to rise through you. They think I linger at your side because I crave what hangs around your neck. Do you?" she asked, but her voice did not accuse. It trembled with something gentler, something waiting. He shook his head slowly. "I want only the space beside you. No pedestal, no claim, just that space, where I can stand and look at the world with you." A wind rose over the hill, sharp and clean. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the earth, the honesty, the moment. When she opened them, they shone not with tears, but with clarity. "You fear my title," she said. "I feared my chair, and yet we are here without either holding us." A slow, trembling smile touched his lips, and then, softly, gently, as if to confirm that the world would not break, he touched her cheek. It was not rushed. It was not stolen. His fingers merely rested there, a silent vow in flesh and breath, and in that touch lived every emotion neither of them had dared name. Eleanor leaned into it, and then, as the first full ray of sun broke over the edge of the horizon, she reached up, touched his hand with her own, and whispered, "Yes." His eyes searched hers. "Yes, to what?" "Yes," she repeated, her voice firmer now, "to what you just asked, without asking. Yes, I'll face them. Yes, I'll live out loud. And yes, I want that space beside you to be yours." Their kiss, when it came, was not desperate. It was stillness and warmth. It was breath shared in the hush of new light. It was everything the world had denied them, and everything they chose to claim regardless. When they returned to Whitcomb, the city had begun to stir. The bells of Bath Abbey rang faintly in the distance, and shops were opening their doors. The scandalous Duchess and the soldier from nowhere returned not as gossip, but as truth. By noon, Eleanor sat at her writing desk in the garden salon, the window thrown wide to the breeze, her pen moving across heavy parchment. A tea, a gathering, a public invitation sent not through intermediaries or secret messengers, but with Eleanor's seal, her name and her signature. An afternoon of music and conversation, a select list of guests, an open door. Mrs. Baines received the news with narrowed eyes but offered no argument. Beatrice nodded slowly, then offered a rare, genuine smile. Dr. Kent, upon hearing the news, muttered something about finally proving half the city wrong. And in a parlor across the city, Lady Honoria Vale received a folded note with no ornamentation. It bore no plea, only 3 sentences. "She intends to host. Do not support her. Your silence will be rewarded." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Percival. Lady Honoria read it slowly. Once, twice. Then, with a movement as elegant as it was final, she folded the note in half and dropped it into the flames. The paper curled and blackened in the grate, the ink turning to ash. She watched it burn, her eyes sharp with thought, and said to no one in particular, "This city forgets that I do not favor cowards." At Whitcomb House, as the sun dipped once more into the folds of twilight, Eleanor stood at the window once again. But this time, she did not watch the horizon for answers. She smiled at it, and it smiled back. The waters of Bath, warm and laced with minerals from the ancient spring, glistened beneath the delicate morning light. Steam rose from their surface like a veil of forgetfulness, cloaking the scent of lavender oils and idle conversation. Eleanor sat near the marble edge, her gloved hands resting delicately on her lap as Dr. Kent discussed the benefits of circulation and warmth. Gabriel, seated across from her in a discreet waiting alcove, watched her from the corner of his eye, never intruding, always near. It had been a serene morning, serene in the way moments are just before the storm breaks. "I dare say," Dr. Kent murmured, adjusting his spectacles as he jotted down notes, "that your posture has improved since your last treatment, and your pallor brighter." Eleanor offered a faint smile. Apparently scandal nourishes the complexion. Gabriel looked up then, eyes searching hers, but she diverted her gaze toward the window. Outside, Bath stirred with elegance and pretense, unaware that in just hours her world would crack once again. They returned to Whitcomb House near noon. The moment the carriage turned onto the long gravel path, something was wrong. The estate was too quiet. The windows of the north wing stood open despite the cool day. Servants milled about the side gardens with stiff backs and averted gazes. Smoke lingered faintly in the air, not from the hearths, but from something that had been extinguished too late. The moment her wheels touched the entrance hall floor, Eleanor knew. Beatrice met them before the footman could speak. Her face was pale beneath her turban, and though she stood tall, there was a sharpness in her eyes that Gabriel had only seen once before, in the eyes of a commander watching his regiment fall. "There's been an incident," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "Percival petitioned the magistrate while you were away, claimed concerns over your ability to manage the estate's affairs. He sent an inspector this morning." Eleanor's breath caught. Gabriel stepped forward, voice low and tight. "Without notice? Without approval?" "Precisely." Beatrice turned to Eleanor. "They arrived at dawn, questioned the staff, demanded access to every ledger, every drawer, every sealed cabinet." Eleanor's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "And the documents?" "Gone," Beatrice said, eyes dark. "The financial statements, the letters to the steward in London, even your father's original land deeds. Vanished." A weight settled over the room, thick and leaden. "And the fire?" Gabriel asked. Beatrice exhaled slowly. "An hour after they left, north wing, storage room. A maid, young Anna, was fetching linens and smelled smoke. She managed to escape, though her arm was badly burned. The fire was contained, but what survived..." She held out a singed folder, half blackened, its contents ash around the edges. "Just enough to ruin you, not enough to prove him." The silence that followed was unbearable. Eleanor felt it claw at her, shame, fury, helplessness all coiling together in her throat. The weight of the estate, of the Ashworth name, of every expectation she had dared defy now pressing upon her like a tide meant to drown. "I need to see the wing," she whispered. "No," Beatrice said firmly. "Not yet. The smoke lingers. And besides, I need to see it," Eleanor repeated, louder this time, the tremble in her voice not of weakness but defiance. Gabriel stepped forward. "I'll take her." Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. The corridor that led to the north wing still smelled of soot and damp stone. The light was grey, filtered through smoke-stained windows. The servants had cleaned what they could, but black marks scarred the floor. The door to the storage room hung off its hinges. Gabriel opened it carefully. Inside, the air was heavy with ruin. The shelves were collapsed, the ceiling charred. What little remained had been dampened by buckets of water and now lay in heaps of curling paper and melted wax seals. A single cracked candlestick sat upright on a blackened crate, untouched by the flame as if mocking their efforts. Eleanor rolled forward slowly, her breath tight in her chest. Here it was. The proof of theft now turned to smoke. Her defense obliterated. The work she had done in silence, the trust she had gathered sheet by careful sheet, all reduced to embers. She could hear the whispers already, that she was incapable, that the estate was mismanaged, that Percival had been right all along. She turned her chair, faced Gabriel, and for the first time in many months, her voice broke. "I should have listened," she said. "I should never have let him near the accounts. I gave him permission. I gave him reason." Gabriel stepped closer. "You gave him trust. He used it as a weapon. That is not your fault. But it is my burden." Her eyes shimmered with restrained anguish. "I am a duchess in title, but what am I in practice? A figurehead in a chair, a scandal wrapped in silk, a woman grasping at a legacy she cannot protect." Gabriel dropped to one knee before her, not in reverence, not in pity, but in proximity. He placed his hands gently on the arms of her chair, grounding her, anchoring her. "You are more than what he thinks, more than what they whisper. But I cannot fight this war for you, Eleanor. I can only stand beside you in it." She looked at him, heart thudding, pain and gratitude colliding behind her ribs. "I don't want you beside me when I fall," she whispered. "Then let me help you rise." But she turned her face away. Because in that moment, the strength it would take to accept comfort felt greater than the strength required to endure alone. That night, the estate was locked in silence. The halls no longer echoed with laughter or hope, only with the low groan of old wood and the hum of secrets left unspoken. Eleanor dined alone. Beatrice paced. Gabriel returned to his cottage, his boots heavy with mud, his coat damp with rain that had begun to fall again as though the heavens themselves understood what had passed. He sat at his writing desk, opened his journal, and penned with a hand that trembled more from emotion than fatigue. "She will not let me carry her sorrow. She believes love is not a shield. She is not wrong. But I fear, if I cannot protect her from harm, then what is love worth? Not the kind that watches her burn. Not the kind that stands in ashes. I am afraid, not of her weakness, but of mine, because I want to break rules for her, break vows, break everything." He closed the book. The candle beside him sputtered, and in the dark, the only sound was the wind pressing against the window pane, begging to be let in. The morning of the hearing dawned with a pale and unforgiving sky. A chill clung to the city of Bath, not the kind born of weather, but the cold that preceded reckoning. In every salon and tea room, the whispers had thickened into certainty. The Duchess would stand no role before the magistrate and face public judgment. It would be a spectacle, a scandal, a reckoning. Inside Whitcomb House, the air was hushed. No laughter, no music, no idle chit-chat passed between the staff. The halls, polished and still, seemed to hold their breath. In her private chamber, Lady Eleanor Ashworth sat before the mirror, her maid having just fastened the final hook of her gown. The dress was deep navy silk, the color of loyalty and midnight, with a bodice shaped to perfection and sleeves that framed her arms like armor. No jewels adorned her throat, only a single pearl pin above her heart. Her hair, gathered into a braided crown, glinted with quiet defiance beneath the pale morning light. "You look," Lady Beatrice whispered from the doorway, "like a verdict they are not prepared to receive." Eleanor turned, her hands resting gently on the carved arms of her chair. "I look," she replied, "like a woman who no longer apologizes for breathing." Beatrice nodded, her chin high. "Then go. Show them what dignity looks like when it is no longer for sale." The carriage that bore them to the magistrate's hall was silent inside. Gabriel sat opposite her, his face drawn, his hands clasped in his lap. He had not touched her since the night of the fire. Not out of distance, but out of reverence. She had withdrawn, and he had allowed it. But now, in the taut quiet of that carriage, he looked at her as if seeing her anew. She did not meet his gaze. Not yet. The magistrate's chamber was full before the clock struck 10. Nobles, merchants, gentry, all packed shoulder to shoulder like spectators at a theatre. The room buzzed with anticipation. In the gallery above, Lady Honoria Vale sat resplendent in black lace, her gloved fingers tapping a slow rhythm on her fan, her eyes unreadable. And at the far end of the room stood Lord Percival Ashworth, dressed in a suit of charcoal superfine with a cravat so stiff it looked like a noose. His expression was a mask of serene condescension, but beneath it, those who looked closely could see the gleam of calculation turning fast. The chamber fell silent as Eleanor entered. She did not walk. She wheeled, and yet no one dared speak. The soft sound of her wheels on polished stone echoed like cannon fire in a ballroom. Every eye followed her as she glided to the center of the room, escorted only by the rhythm of her resolve. She stopped before the bench, lifted her chin, and faced the magistrate. "I am Lady Eleanor Ashworth," she began, her voice clear, unwavering. "Duchess of Whitcomb by title, Steward of Whitcomb by choice. I have been accused, quietly and now publicly, of incompetence, of instability, of mismanagement." A murmur rose from the crowd. She did not pause. "Let us speak plainly. I have been accused of being less, because I do not walk as they do, because I do not speak as they expect, because I dare to exist beyond their narrative." Her voice grew stronger. "I have here," she said, lifting a leather-bound folder from her lap, "the remaining records saved from the fire that tore through my estate's north wing. Documents not burned because I carried them myself when the flames began to rise. I also present letters, correspondence with our steward in London, with the cooper, with the apothecary, all bearing my seal, not Lord Percival's." Gasps. Papers passed between the magistrates. Beatrice stood nearby, a pillar of poise, her gaze cold as marble. Eleanor continued, "These letters and ledgers confirm discrepancies, funds diverted, resources misallocated, authorizations forged." She turned her gaze to Percival, whose jaw had tensed, but whose hands remained clasped behind his back. "You petitioned this court under the guise of concern. You painted yourself as protector, but it is not protection to rob a woman of her autonomy. It is not stewardship to strip her of her legacy. It is not concern to silence her while your hands dig through the coffers she fought to preserve." The magistrate raised a hand. "Lord Percival, how do you respond?" Percival stepped forward smoothly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "With respect, Your Honor, the Duchess has endured significant emotional trauma. Her ability to recall accurately is understandably impaired. Her standing in society has been marked by instability and scandal. Her guest," he glanced briefly at Gabriel, "has not gone unnoticed." A flicker of discomfort passed through the crowd. "And yet," Gabriel said, stepping forward, "it is I who have seen her rise every morning and rebuild what others left in ruins. It is I who have carried her reports across towns and sat beside her as she examined every account. She is not unstable. She is unrelenting. And if strength threatens you, Lord Percival, that says more of your character than hers." The room murmured again. The magistrate signaled for silence. "Are there additional witnesses?" Dr. Kent stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. "I can confirm the Duchess has conducted every estate decision with clarity and rationality. The rumors of her instability are the product of gossip, not fact." And then, a hush, a new voice. "I saw him," came the quiet words. From the rear of the room, Anna, the young maid, stood, her arms still wrapped in bandages, her eyes wide but steady. "I saw Lord Percival's footman near the storage wing the night of the fire. He said he was fetching something left behind, but there was no reason for him to be there. And when the flames started, he was gone." The silence turned sharp. Lady Honoria, still seated in the gallery, slowly rose. All eyes turned to her. She descended the steps with unhurried grace, her heels clicking like punctuation. She stood before the crowd, facing the magistrate, her chin lifted in perfect composure. "I have known Lord Percival Ashworth since he was a boy," she said, her voice calm and smooth, "and I have long admired his ambition. But ambition without honor is a dagger without a sheath." She turned toward Eleanor. "There is dignity in honesty. she declared, "and Lady Eleanor Ashworth has shown it today in every breath, every word, every quiet refusal to bend. I withdraw my support of Lord Ashworth's petition, and I advise this court to see not the chair she enters with, but the fire she leaves in her wake." The chamber erupted, voices collided, chairs scraped. The magistrate banged the gavel thrice before restoring order. When quiet returned, the ruling was swift. The petition was denied. All authority was restored to Eleanor. Percival would be subject to formal inquiry. The tide had turned. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the buildings of Bath, casting the stone facades in golden light, Eleanor stepped out of the magistrate's hall and into the street. Crowds lined the edges, not jeering, not whispering, but watching. And when she rolled past, a few bowed, a few more applauded. But it was Gabriel's presence she felt most, silent at her side, his expression unreadable. She looked at him, he looked at her. No words passed, none were needed. The stand had been taken, and she had not only stood, she had risen. The bells of Bath tolled softly that morning, their tones steady and unhurried, as if the city itself acknowledged the verdict with solemn grace. News had spread fast, carried not only by carriages and footmen, but by the silences of drawing rooms and the swift glances of those who claimed not to gossip. Lady Eleanor Ashworth had won. The court had ruled in her favour, stripping Lord Percival of any authority tied to the Whitcomb estate. Charges of falsification and theft were filed. There would be inquiries, of course, and proceedings to follow, but the true sentence had already fallen. Not upon paper, but in the court of public perception. Percival's name no longer carried weight. It clattered across society like a tarnished coin, no longer fit for use. The magistrate's seal had been stamped, but it was not the ink that mattered. It was the silence that followed, the silence of power reclaimed. Back at Whitcomb House, Eleanor moved through the great halls without hesitation. The staff, once hesitant, once guarded, now bowed with renewed respect. They no longer watched her as if she might shatter beneath scrutiny. They watched her as one watches a storm pass, with reverence and awe. In the library, the ledgers had been returned. In the drawing room, Beatrice sat composing letters in a careful hand, her turban pinned at an angle that spoke of vindication. And in the rose garden, now blooming fully beneath early summer skies, Gabriel walked with Flint at his side, pausing every now and then to brush a fallen petal from the path. But the house, for all its restored order, pulsed with something else, a tension not of scandal or fear, but of decision. Eleanor found him there in the orchard, where the white blossoms swayed like confetti, waiting for a celebration. Gabriel stood with one hand resting on the low stone wall, staring out across the valley, where a faint line of chimney smoke marked the edge of town. He did not turn when she approached, but he spoke before she could. "They offered me a position." Her breath caught. "Where?" "At the town infirmary," he said, voice low, hands steady. "To oversee patient care, veterans, widows, children too poor for doctors." She nodded once. "That sounds like meaningful work." "It is." A pause. "But it would mean leaving Whitcomb." "Not entirely, but enough." Silence settled between them, deep and aching. "I didn't come to persuade you," she said after a moment, her voice soft but sure. "I came because you needed to say it aloud." He turned then, slowly, his eyes finding hers. "Eleanor," he said, and the way her name left his lips was not habit but longing. "What am I to you?" She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man he was, not the soldier, not the scandal, not the shadow in her garden, but the man who knelt with her in a ballroom, the man who designed ramps instead of walls, the man who let her fall apart without trying to gather the pieces for her. "You are the only person I've never had to explain myself to," she said, "and the only one whose presence does not diminish mine." His jaw tightened. "Then why do you look at me as if I am something to weigh and measure?" "Because I must," she answered, her eyes shimmering. "Not for fear, but for truth." She turned her chair slightly, the wheels crunching over a patch of gravel. "Too many women marry to be saved," she said. "To be folded into a name, a home, a man's future. I cannot do that. Not now. Not ever." He said nothing. The wind stirred the leaves and a petal floated down between them. "I will marry you," she said, her voice shaking only at the edges. "Not to be rescued, not to be defined, but because I believe in building something new, with no ghosts in the walls." Gabriel inhaled, sharp and quiet. "And if I say I still want to protect you?" She smiled faintly. "Then do it by standing beside me, not in front of me." He stepped closer, took her hand, not as a question, not as a plea, but as a promise. His thumb grazed the edge of her glove, the simplest touch, the loudest vow. "I never wanted a duchess," he said, "only a woman brave enough to be one." Eleanor's answer was not spoken. It lived in her gaze, in the steadiness of her spine, in the warmth of her fingers against his. And so, beneath the orchard trees that had once withered in silence, she said yes again. But this time, it was not to possibility. It was to permanence. The wedding came quietly. No fanfare, no parade of nobility. Invitations were penned in Eleanor's own hand, addressed to those who mattered, those who had seen her not as a relic of tragedy, but as a flame refusing to extinguish. Lady Beatrice, regal in slate-grey silk, stood by the window the morning of the ceremony, watching the staff bustle below. "Small weddings," she murmured, "require more courage than grand ones. You cannot hide behind spectacle. You walk in full view of your own heart." Eleanor, seated before the mirror, adjusted the comb in her hair. There were no jewels, no veil, only honesty and lavender pinned near her collarbone. Dr. Kent arrived just after noon, his cravat uneven and his hands shaking. "I've never walked a duchess down an aisle," he said, chuckling nervously. "You've helped her stand," Eleanor replied. "This is simply a longer walk." The ceremony was held in the old chapel at the edge of the estate. The stone walls were lined with ivy, and wildflowers peeked through the floor tiles. The pews were filled with the quiet hum of expectation. Tenants, staff, patients from Dr. Kent's practice. Even Lady Honoria arrived, late, fashionably, and with no intention of being the center of anything. When Eleanor entered, silence fell. She moved not with grandeur, but with grace, her chair gliding along the runner of woven petals. At her side, Dr. Kent kept pace, eyes forward, pride etched into every line of his face. Gabriel stood beneath the arched window, the sunlight casting shadows behind him. He wore no medals, no uniform, only his best coat, and the look of a man who had chosen a home and a future in the same breath. Their vows were whispered, but they echoed louder than any proclamation. "I do not promise to be whole," she said. "I do not ask you to be," he replied. "I do not promise to be easy. I do not seek ease. I promise only that I will not vanish, not again, not into silence, not into shame. I promise only that I will not ask you to." And when their hands met, it was not with trembling, it was with certainty. As they emerged from the chapel, laughter spilled from the crowd. Petals tossed into the air, catching the wind like blessings unbound. Flint barked once, jubilant, and chased a ribbon across the lawn. Beatrice stood at the edge of the garden, her hands clasped, eyes misted with something she would never name aloud. Dr. Kent lingered nearby, surrounded by children asking about bones and stethoscopes. In that moment, Eleanor did not feel like a woman restored. She felt like a woman rewritten, and when Gabriel placed his hand gently at her back, not pushing, not guiding, just touching, she knew. This was not the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a life, one chosen, freely, proudly, unapologetically. 2 years had passed, but time had not worn Whitcomb House down as it once had. Instead, it had transformed the estate into something new, something alive. Where ivy once crept with neglect and windows wept with dust, now came warmth, light, and a subtle kind of music. the laughter of children in the gardens, the murmur of hands at work in sunlit halls, the clink of teacups from the refurbished solarium, where women who had once been silenced now read, embroidered, and sometimes simply breathed. The great house had not been rebuilt, it had been reimagined. It began with a single door widened. Then a ramp added to the front steps, carved with care and discreet flourishes. Not an afterthought, not a concession, but a welcome. Soon came more changes. Whitcomb's east wing, once shuttered, was reopened as a convalescence lodge. The south gallery became a sanctuary for war widows. The stables were converted into a training center for returned soldiers, and Eleanor's private garden, once hidden behind hedges, now held a gravel path that wound openly through the orchard. None of these transformations made the house less noble, only more human. Eleanor moved through it daily, her wheels gliding over floors that no longer resisted her presence. She wore no crown, but she ruled with elegance. People came to her now, not for spectacle or scandal, but for guidance, for courage, for a reminder that grace could be firm and strength tender. On the morning of the hospital wing's inauguration, the skies of Bath broke open in the gentlest way, shedding sunlight like silk over the rooftops and fields. Carriages lined the narrow road, and footmen in sober livery ushered guests toward the newly constructed annex. The building itself stood beside the infirmary, a structure of modest brick and stone, but its windows were large, its doors wide, and its corridors designed not as passageways, but invitations. It bore no plaque to Eleanor's name, but it breathed her spirit in every arch and threshold. Inside, patients waited, nurses moved with calm efficiency. A young boy with a twisted foot traced the edges of his wheeled cart, pausing when he saw her arrive. Eleanor did not enter with fanfare. She simply wheeled forward, dressed in a pale lilac gown embroidered with white stitching, her hair pinned up with a single mother-of-pearl comb. Her gloves, cream-colored and worn, covered hands that had not only held quills and letters, but lives. Beside her stood Gabriel, now officially administrator of the Veterans Employment Board of Somerset. His coat was dark wool, his posture straight, but his hand, when it rested briefly on the curve of her chair, held no formality, only grounding. They entered the new hospital wing together. A small crowd had gathered, physicians, nurses, patrons. At the front, Dr. Silas Kent stepped aside as Eleanor took her place before a lectern made of polished elm. The room fell still. She looked over the faces, some familiar, some not, but all expectant, all waiting, and then she began. 2 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the absence of grandeur, I stood in a courtroom and was asked whether I could be trusted to manage what had always been mine. Not my title, not my fortune, but my voice, my reason, my agency. She paused. Her gaze swept slowly across the audience. Since then, I have learned that what is most fragile in us is often not our bodies. It is the space between being seen and being believed. A hush rippled through the crowd, not of discomfort, but of understanding. This wing is not a monument to suffering. It is a testament to design, to intention, to the radical notion that every body, in any form, deserves to move through this world with dignity. She rested her hand lightly on the wheel of her chair. A door should never be locked merely because it opens differently. The silence that followed was not stunned, it was reverent. Then came the applause. No thunder, no eruption, just steady hands meeting steady hands, and in that sound lived every battle quietly won. Later that afternoon, Eleanor watched from beneath a magnolia tree as patients explored the new wing, laughter echoing softly from the garden path. Nearby, Dr. Kent stood reading from his latest paper on adaptive design to 2 young surgeons who scribbled notes as if transcribing gospel. In the orchard, young boys practiced navigation with mobility carts. Gabriel stood near them, guiding one gently around a crooked route, his voice calm, his eyes alert. He wore his title lightly, not sir, not director, simply Gabriel. Lady Beatrice, seated at the garden's edge beneath a wide parasol, watched all of it with the faint smile of a woman who had waited too long to be proven right. Around her, several young ladies, war widows, daughters of disowned women, listened as she explained correspondence etiquette with the same precision once reserved for political strategy. She had not softened, but she had bloomed. Eleanor wheeled herself across the orchard, letting the path guide her past the rose trellises, now thick with bloom. The scent of summer clung to the air, damask and mint, wild thyme, and something else, something that smelled like healing. Gabriel joined her as if by instinct. They said nothing for a while. They did not need to. He reached down, brushed a petal from her shoulder. She looked up at him, eyes crinkling with the smile she reserved only for him. The one that came not from amusement, but from knowing. "I never thought," she said softly, "that this house would breathe again." Gabriel looked out at the children weaving between the apple trees, the nurses laughing over a basket of fresh towels, the young man testing the threshold ramp in his new wheeled chair. "It doesn't just breathe," he murmured. "It sings." She turned to him. "And you?" He shrugged with a boyish grin. "I hum along." She laughed then, not the polite sound of a lady in company, but the rich, full sound of a woman unguarded. He joined her, and their laughter mingled with the voices in the orchard. As they reached the edge of the estate, the great iron gates of Whitcomb stood wide open. 2 years ago they had groaned on their hinges, stubborn and rusted from disuse. Now they welcomed. Eleanor paused at the threshold, gazing out toward the road beyond, where a young woman in a bonnet pushed a wooden cart, and a war veteran leaned on a walking stick. They nodded as they passed, tipping their heads in greeting. Not deference, recognition. She looked at Gabriel. He stood tall beside her, his coat collar turned slightly against the breeze, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. She took a breath and crossed the threshold. The wheels turned smoothly over the stone. She was the first to pass through, and the last to look back, not from doubt, but from triumph. Whitcomb House stood bathed in amber light, as if the past itself had paused to remember. The roses had returned for another summer, sprawling wildly across the trellises with more freedom than elegance, just as Eleanor liked them. Their petals, soft and defiant, danced in the afternoon breeze like pages of a story too beautiful to end. 8 years had passed, and still the gates of Whitcomb remained open. From the eastern veranda, Eleanor watched the children run beneath the orchard trees. 5 of them, all limbs and laughter. 2 belonged to the house, the others to friends who visited often, their homes as open as this one. A girl with Gabriel's eyes darted past her older brother, squealing with joy as she toppled into a pile of fresh-cut grass. Eleanor's hands rested gently on the arms of her chair, aged by sun and time, but still polished, still part of her body, like breath. A strand of grey shimmered at her temple now, and though her figure remained upright and proud, her movements had softened with the grace of years. She had not changed. She had grown. Inside, Gabriel was reading beside the hearth, a child curled into his lap, head heavy with sleep. His beard had grayed along the jaw, but his eyes, clear, steady, full of fire, had not dimmed. He had become not just a husband, but a father, a mentor, a man of the village. His work with veterans had expanded into a national project. He now advised Parliament on reintegration policy, though he never wore the title of advisor aloud. He preferred to be known simply as Eleanor's partner. Their love had not withered, it had weathered, and in doing so, had deepened like the roots of the orchard trees that now bore more fruit than ever before. Eleanor still spoke publicly, though not as often. When she did, halls filled, more for the certainty of her voice than the novelty of her chair. Young women came from afar to hear her speak of design, of dignity, of what it meant to walk through life differently and still be whole. And men listened too, because in her truth there was no judgment, only invitation. She had become more than a duchess. She had become change. In the west garden, Beatrice sat beneath a parasol, her hair now completely silver, her presence no less commanding. A younger woman beside her took dictation, while Beatrice offered opinions on estate law and marriage reform with the same dry wit that once sent suitors fleeing. She had never married, but she had never lacked family. Not here, not now. Dr. Kent had passed 2 winters ago. His absence was still felt like a breath held too long. But before he left, he had seen his life's work published, his theories on adaptive architecture adopted by half the colleges in England. His portrait now hung in the library, not above the fireplace but beside it, eye level with Eleanor's chair and Lord Percival. History had not forgotten him. He spent the remainder of his life in quiet exile, stripped of lands and favour. No trial ever brought him to public shame, but the whispers had become iron bars. He lived alone in Dorset, visited by no one, his name no longer spoken in the rooms that mattered. His price had been exacted not by vengeance, but by time. As the sun dipped low, Eleanor wheeled herself down the path toward the orchard, where Gabriel now stood beneath the tree they had once called the center of the world. Their youngest daughter had fallen asleep on the blanket beside him, clutching a book too big for her hands. He looked up, and his smile held the years in it. "Did I miss the grand event?" she asked. "You missed the chase," he replied, "but you're just in time for the stillness." She joined him beneath the tree. They sat for a long time, watching the last light settle over the land they had reclaimed, first from ruin, then from silence, and finally from history itself. "I never imagined this," she whispered. He looked at her. "You built this?" She turned her head, resting it gently against his shoulder. "No," she said. "We did." In the distance, the orchard echoed with footsteps, small, clumsy, joyful. And from the open gates of Whitcomb, the world continued to come and go. But here, beneath the sky of 8 full years, love remained. Not as legend, but as legacy. Every story leaves a trace. Some are soft as a whisper, others echo long after the final word. The Duchess in a wheelchair never went out. Until a stranger gave her hope is not just a tale of love. It is a story of reclaiming one's voice, of learning that strength wears many faces, and of discovering that the truest doors in life are the ones we open for ourselves and for others. Eleanor's journey reminds us that dignity is not granted by titles, health, or reputation. It is chosen, defended, and lived. And love, when it comes, should never diminish who we are. It should reflect who we've dared to become. If you felt moved by this story, if it touched something quiet and deep within you, leave us a comment. We would love to know what part of Eleanor's journey stayed with you the most. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word legacy in the comments. That way, we'll know you walked this path with us all the way, and that means more than you can imagine. If you'd like to support the team behind these heartfelt stories, you can send a super thanks in any amount that feels right to you. It helps us continue to write, narrate, and share these timeless romances with the care they deserve. But if you're not able to give that way, no worries. Sharing this story with someone you know, someone who loves historical fiction or just needs a little hope, is just as powerful. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this romance, we've added more beautiful tales in the cards above. Each one holds its own world, its own heartbeat. We hope you'll explore them. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling, because stories like this one only live when someone like you chooses to feel them.